Thanks for being here. It's delightful to have Shogo Suzuki, Associate Professor at the Department of Politics at the University of Manchester. Shogo's primary research is on Chinese and Japanese foreign and security policy, often from a constructivist perspective. He has written extensively on nationalism, ontological security, and not just specific to Japan-China relations. From both vantage points, Shogo actually uses extensively Chinese language sources, but also in the context of Japan-Korea relations more recently. I think that was published in the Cambridge Review of International Affairs. And Shogo's writings figure highly in my syllabi, especially when focusing on the international relations of East Asia. And one of the starting points, in fact, of the international relations of East Asia is on the ideas of order and of international or regional order. And Shogo has published this incredibly impactful book called Civilization and Empire on Japan and Chinese views on international order. China and Japan's encounter with European international society. That book, published by Routledge, is really a story of the transition from what you could call a Sinocentric order to an encounter with Western gunboat diplomacy and the Janus-faced civilizational mission that came along with this Western international society. And there he applies actually an English school approach to the study of international relations. He has also edited a book with Yongjin Zhang and Joe Quirk on international orders in the early modern world before the rise of the West, again specific to these subjects. And Shogo is a mentor by acquisition, so to speak, because he was my external examiner for my PhD.
So
I benefited greatly from his insight, both vicariously through his writings and over the years in person. Today's topic is going to draw on a new avenue of research, which is on the relevance of racism in international politics, specifically on how non-white states' rise is allowed or not, or contained or constrained by white states. And Shogo will of course, delve deep into the concepts surrounding these. Well, you know, he will give an introduction to a concept specific to the role of race in international politics, with which can be applied also to what we witness nowadays as the world order is in transition with China, not just China's rise, but also the rise of India or other players. And how the US and the West writ large can accommodate to the rise of said actors. But Shogo, as I understand, will focus on the so-called Japan threat from the 1980s and early 1990s. So without further ado, Shogo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And Giulio and I, academically, we always disagree. Yes, not always, but frequently. So this is a very, successful example of, ideological difference making no difference when it comes to getting along. If only international politics were like this as well. But anyway, today's talk is called "Redrawing the Global Color Line in International Politics," and the kind of subtitle is "Who Still Remembers the Japan Threat?" And are we all old enough to remember it a little bit, or Please don't say I'm the oldest in the room.
Not the yellow peril from the late 19th.
I do, but as somebody who grew up in Japan in the late 1980s, I do remember this little bit. It's called, it's known as Japan bashing, and it's something that has been on my mind for a while, partly because of how ridiculous it sounds now, but also how quickly it fizzled out the moment Japan's economy went down. Hopefully it'll be of some interest to you all. But before we start, is it this one we press? No, this one is it. We start off by saying that I've come here to be bashed and tenderized by you all. Okay, I sent this. I sent this to for review, and of course it got rejected. And oh yes. Reviewer A and B didn't like it. It's usually reviewer B, but this time nobody liked it. So there we go. So just back to the drawing board for me. Any kind of help to improve it? I'm here in part to kind of see how it could be improved, and in particular, if it's always the hardest part, but framing the question and packaging the argument is always the hardest part. And of course, this is where I fell. So any ideas on how that could be improved would be much appreciated. But of course, other questions are very much welcome as well. Okay, so let's have a look at the kind of context and starting point of this whole paper then. Well, in a way, the starting point is, of course, that finally, we are finally, well, at least within the discipline of international relations, we are finally becoming aware that race matters. Right. In a way, this is not particularly news, but in some ways, international relations has been somewhat blind to this issue. And at least we can see how it's been manifested in the study of international relations in a couple of ways. There's a kind of branch of studies which has looked at how international relations as a discipline was, how it started out, is linked to colonial administration, these kind of thing. I think Brian Schmidt is a person who's looked at that. So that's one. And the other one might be looking at how the kind of seminal texts, which are often used in our theorizing international politics, actually based on writers who had deep, what shall we say, racial prejudices. So looking at the kind of racial foundation, the racist kind of roots of the foundation knowledge of international relations, for instance. And at times, some of it has led to very, very public and bitter arguments. And one example of this would be Howland Richter-Montpetier's study on ontological security, which looked at how ontological security and the founding texts had deeply racial kind of foundations, and the theory itself might have racist foundations, and the proponents of ontological security, the securitization theory reacted very strongly to this, and it led to a fairly public kind of dispute in the end. So that's another one. Another strand has been how racism and racial boundaries play a role in foreign policy, security, immigration. I think this has been, increasingly explored in our field as well. However, despite this growing awareness, arguably the link between racism and world order making, especially in an empirical and policy context, requires great attention, says Amitabh Bhattacharya. And to him, world order making is a term which denotes how the world, or a big part of it, is organized politically, economically, and culturally at a given period of history. And this isn't to say that studies in this genre don't exist. Existing scholarship on this topic has tended to concentrate primarily on the historical case studies when European imperialism had reached its kind of the height of its powers, right? And if you look at the Asian case, you look at studies by Bull and Watson or Gong or myself, and we looked at how the Westphalian order expanded into Asia, and of course this was this came on the back of imperialism as well, and also with imperialism also came this deeply racist notion that Western ways of doing things were the only way of doing things, right? And of course, the other side of the story is Japan emulated the West and started its own imperial kind of expansion as well, modeling itself on the Western empires at the time. But so these do exist, but these are mainly historical, and how racial hierarchies that existed in the 19th century, they might have changed in form nowadays, but how racial hierarchies might matter in our supposedly decolonized global order today remains on the whole an underexplored topic despite post-colonial contributions. Okay. So what's the point then in this context of looking at the Japan threat discourse then? Okay, so the Japan threat discourse gained prominence in the late 1980s and the early 1990s, and it postulated that Japan was going to be the next biggest threat to American hegemony. Okay, and it fizzled away very, very quickly once Japan's economy started to tank and the bubble burst, right? But the fact that the Japan threat theory itself, I think, raises quite some interesting questions or puzzles if you're more inclined to think that way. So one thing is that Japan, unlike China, is a liberal democracy and is a close ally of the United States. Okay. Nowadays, when China is singled out as a threat, and some critics say that this is a new version of the yellow peril, people who defend that view often quickly say, no, it's nothing to do with race. It's more to do with regime type. Right? It's because China is an authoritarian state. That's why it's a threat to global order. Well, Japan is definitely not like China in terms of political systems, and if democratic peace theory is correct, Japan and the US are highly unlikely to go to war. Yet, Japan was seen as a threat. Okay? And of course, Japan is by no means a perfect country, we all know that, but it doesn't have the record of systematic abuse of human rights, which is comparable to China either. So in an international order where human rights is increasing the standard of civilization, Japan certainly seems to be meeting that standard. But also, it's militarily, it's heavily dependent on the United States, and it is in no position whatsoever to challenge the US either. And even if it tried to, there's no way it could pay for it, and they couldn't find the people either, with falling birth rates in Japan. So there's no, even in the 1990s, early 1990s, there was very little prospect of Japan actually being able to having the capacity to challenge the United States militarily. But also, interestingly, around the same time the Japan threat was popular, there's another kind of potential rising power in the horizon, and that was Germany. Germany was on the course and eventually reunified, and certainly politicians like Margaret Thatcher did talk about were fearful of a reunited Germany, right? And also, some people were saying that a newly kind of ever tightly integrating Europe could be the next challenger to Europe. But these voices were very, very few. And it was the Japan threat proponents, but the Japan threat discourse, which gained a lot more traction. But also, if you look at the context of the Cold War period, Japan was pretty much seen as a member of the West. All of a sudden, it became a threat. And it was excluded from the West. Why this sudden exclusion, right? So, given that this came in the context of a perceived decline of America and a rise in Japan, the question does arise as to whether a non-white state is seen as an inherent threat to global order, right? It's the singling out of Japan, despite its despite the fact it's a liberal democracy, which kind of sparks this kind of interest within me. Okay, so here is at least the argument at the moment. Okay, 3 points. I think the case of Japan will allow us to examine the more fluid nature of racial hierarchies and boundaries, and the inherently political process by which the global color line is redrawn. Okay. But also, the other point I'd like to forward is that the redrawing of the global color line is a reaction to ontological insecurities emanating from predominant white states who have traditionally and continue to enjoy preeminence in international politics, despite the rise of China and all that. So therefore, the rise of a non-white state disturbs its status quo. Okay, even if it's a close ally of the West, much narrowly defined. And here I'm talking about Europe, Western Europe and North America predominantly, right? The rise of non-white states does disturb the status quo, and it's more likely to get labeled as something qualitatively different on the basis of race, no matter how subtle the expression might be. Okay, and what are the reasons for these kind of ontological insecurities? Possibly, this is something I need to explore further in the actual paper, but I think we can afford a number of potential explanations. One thing is international relations as a whole. It's in the discipline of international relations, global history usually starts from the discovery of the New World by Columbus, right? And that's the start of a conscious. That's the birth of a consciousness. So the story goes of a European world, a European international order, and then you get the Westphalian international system and all of that, right? And then the Westphalian system expands across the world, and now we have a global international society, so to speak. But all of this story is usually told from the point of view of Western or Western or white power, right? So I think conceptually we are not very used. We are actually poorly equipped to imagine a world where the East is reigning supreme, right? At least within the discipline of international relations. Another one could be American exceptionalism as well. One problem which was pointed out in the paper was the West and the United States get conflated a little bit, and it's a fair point, right? But the Japan threat theory comes predominantly from it was shared to an extent in other countries like Australia, and we had the French Prime Minister, who you'll see later, voiced similar views, but it was predominantly an American affair, right? And it could be that American exceptionalism sees the rise of any state other than itself as a potential threat, potentially, but maybe the rise of a state which doesn't have a similar kind of ethnic or civilizational makeup might trigger it a lot more. And those are the kind of potential explanations I have for why the rise of a non-white state might trigger ontological insecurities. But if there's anything else that could be added to that, I'll be interested to hear about that. Okay, so what have existing works in race in a decolonized world talked about then, right? There is one wing which tends to emphasize moral progress, okay? And here, these works are kind of often undergirded by an implicit view that American hegemony, particularly after 1945, is relatively free of the racism that accompanied European or British hegemony. That's one. But also, others would say that decolonization means that all states are now sovereign equals, regardless of their ethnic makeup. So, and also, overt racism has become taboo. Okay, and John Vincent has said that principles of racial equality and of anti-colonialism were now part of the official doctrine of international society. Right? And so here are a couple of examples. So there's one by Thomas Bostelman. He said, American leaders after 1945 accommodated themselves with varying degrees of enthusiasm to the new era of racial equality. And after the Cold War, the United States had emerged as the multiracial leader of a multiracial world. Okay, so that's to my mind, a fairly rosy view of it. Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, John Vincent says that he does acknowledge that there is a caste system on economic grounds where the rich world is predominantly white and the poor world predominantly colored, he says. However, here he argued that this division was much exaggerated, and he overlooked the fact that the former colonies were now not merely equal members of international society, but powers of close to the first rank, and that the several East Asian countries that have enjoyed such economic success can hardly be said still to be straining under a racial yoke. I think that's interesting, right? At least, East Asian states are seen as being not coming under, racial prejudice anymore, right? They seem to be the kind of successful ones, right? So anyway, East Asian countries are singled out as a good example of how decolonization has taken place. Mm-hmm. Of course, post-colonialism has been a lot less dazzled by this apparent moral progress, right? And Post-colonialism has, of course, explored colonial representations of the developing world, as well as how colonial relations continue to influence North-South relations, particularly in political economy. And they've also looked at how imposition of benchmarks of good governance by Western-dominated international institutions have resulted in paternalism, for instance. And more interestingly, Alex Bader has said that he says that a racialized transnational political economy that emerged in the aftermath of the genocidal land appropriation in North and South America and enslavement of Africans resulted in a process of racialization that expanded across the planet and created material and ideological reality in which racial difference and hierarchy came to be understood as a constitutive of the order of things. Right? And he says that the resulting global racial imaginary has produced an incessant anxiety and fear that the racial hierarchies are themselves prone to crisis and violent upheaval, and any crisis or calling into question of white supremacy is met with extraordinary and creative violence. And he has in mind, of course, the yellow peril discourse which emerged, or the restriction of Asian immigration in America. These kind of things is what Bader has in mind. But he does mention that we are living a similar political moment at the moment today, with a growing rhetoric against anti-immigration, right? And also fears by people such as Huntington about the dilution of certain values because of too many ethnic groups, right? The Hispanics in the case of Huntington, right? So in a way, yeah, he possibly Bader is pointing to this still continuing, lingering influence of, shall we say, how global hierarchies still linger in the minds, and the obsession of this might have created backlash even today, right? So these are kind of interesting things we could look at, but certainly they might. You could say that there could be some gaps. Now, how big these gaps are something that is certainly debatable, and I'll be interested to see what you think. But one thing is that existing studies, post-colonial studies in particular, they do tend to look at very, very clear racial others, right? And these might be, this is the global south, particularly Africa, or maybe Islamic fundamentalism, something which is completely alien, shall we say. This does clearly and powerfully demonstrate that race and racism matter, but in a way, you could say it only captures a small number of extreme, or I should say more blatant examples of racism. And it could potentially miss more widespread practices of racist imaginary which might exist. That's one point. And the other one is that the existing studies tend to study arguably clear-cut others, okay? And they don't always capture the dynamic and fluid nature by which racial boundaries are drawn and redrawn, right? So in a way, actors like the Global South or Islamic fundamentalism or maybe authoritarian states in the non-Western world, they are already, the color is already drawn there, and it's probably not going to move until something, unless something radical happens, right? And in that way, it gives a static picture of the global color line and might not capture the dynamics that might apply less to the less noticeable others, right? And I think we often miss the possibility that a significant number of actors might fall in between the gaps. Right? And a classic example of this is what we call the model migrants, right? The model migrants are the ones who are maybe not as obviously ethnically or culturally different. They might also align themselves very closely to the host society's values, right? And conform very successfully to the extent that they are seen as, oh, they've integrated, right? But history does show us that these things can actually suddenly change depending on the political wind, how the political wind blows. So, but often this dynamic where things can suddenly change it can't really be captured just by looking at obvious others, so to speak, right? So that was what I was thinking of, where there's some gaps are. So what would the contribution be? This is how I see it so far, okay? And the reviewers thought otherwise. It's not strong enough. So any ideas on this one would be interesting as well. Mm-hmm. So one point is that existing studies focus on actors for being obvious racial others, and they don't always capture adequately the dynamic nature by racial boundaries drawn today, right? So, so we need to move beyond the static picture of a particular racial hierarchy the hierarchy can actually change a little bit. Yeah. But also the second contribution is in order to gain a more nuanced picture of the construction of racial hierarchies and boundaries, we need to pay attention to how political actors who are counted as part of a community that is predominantly white, but subsequently and arbitrarily find themselves excluded or re-excluded on racial grounds. I think that's a dynamic that is worth looking at least empirically. Right. So this is what leads us to the case of the Japan threat. Okay. So what is the Japan threat then? The Japan threat itself, the discourse does predate the demise of the USSR, but it gained prominence in the context of a zenith of the US's fifth wave, according to Huntington, of declinism since the 1950s. And we are talking mainly about the late 1980s. Yeah. And around this time, it was argued that although the US might have won the Cold War, it was declining because it had overstretched itself to fight the Soviet Union. So in a way, it's another kind of a classic case of hegemonic overreach, right? So the US was exhausted, overstretched, and now this was allowing Japan to fill that power vacuum. That was one strand of the kind of triggers for the Japan threat theory. The other one was that now that the Cold War had ended and the Soviet Union had been defeated, now military power itself was not the kind of key weapon to maintain supremacy. It was economic power that was going to matter an awful lot more. And in this context, Japan, which was then the second largest economy, was the best place to kind of challenge American supremacy around this time. So that's that. That's the kind of context in which Japan threat emerged. But I think it's important to just keep in mind that this was something quite new in the sense that Japan was actually seen as a member of the West during the Cold War. Okay, in this period during the Cold War, a US ally equals member of the West, and Japan's position within that grouping was pretty much unquestioned, right? And of course, that in turn makes it even more interesting on how it was, kind of excluded from this grouping. So in a way, you could say that the story of the Japan threat is also a story of how the West was redefined to exclude Japan from it. Okay, so what were kind of explanations of the Japan threat theory then? There is what I call quasi-realism. I call it quasi-realism because actually it goes against the principles of realism, actually. One argument was that trade surpluses resulted from Japan's allegedly unfair trading practices were enriching Japan but sapping American wealth. So in other words, a kind of zero-sum theory of economic growth. And the other one was that Japan was using its financial clout to buy up American industry, and consequently the US was in danger of losing its international influence to Japan, as well as become dependent on Japanese financial power and imports for the maintenance of its own economic growth. Mm-hmm. So in a way, Japan, gaining of American economic power meant the axiomatic loss of American economic power and therefore with it influence. Okay, so global influence and global economic power we seen as interlinked and also zero-sum in a way. But around this time, Huntington was also warning that Japanese investments in the movie industry or endowments in universities would enhance Japan's ability to influence American public opinion in its favor and hasten the end of American primacy. Right? And it's quite interesting to kind of note the similarity that you see today with China's own soft power, or such as the use of Chinese mainland textbooks in universities would somehow influence the minds of American Western youth and make them more pro-China. There's a kind of a similar kind of ring of similarity to it. It's just something in passing, right? Okay, so that's one branch of quasi-realism. The other one is the geopolitical variant, and the main one here would be Friedman and Lebard's book, The Coming War with Japan. Yes, it seems totally outlandish nowadays, but there we go. Yeah, I have actually because I like collecting these, what should I say, antiquities. I've ended up with 2 copies of this book, even though it's in retrospect it's kind of garbage. But anyway. Friedman and Lebard argue that Japan would challenge the US because of the tyranny of geopolitics. Okay, and they're saying that basically, even if Japan didn't want to go to war with America, geopolitics would force it to go to war with America. And they argued, their argument in a nutshell is that as Japan got more and more powerful, the US would find it unbearable to continue providing for the security of Japan and let Japan free ride and become more powerful, right? And therefore, in order to kind of stop Japan from free riding and getting more powerful at America's expense, it would block trading routes. In return, Japan would this would result in Japan wanting to carve its own Lebensraum to survive this. But also, Friedman and Lebard say that a great power does need its own kind of sphere of influence, right? So of course, it's going to try and get rid of American influence around that area. Yeah? You might note that there's somebody else who thinks in these terms, and his name is Putin, who regards Ukraine pretty much as his own backyard, and how dare the rest of the world meddle in that. But it's kind of similar kind of thinking, really. And they said that as this, because of this tyranny of geopolitics, a clash between Japan and the US was pretty much inevitable. Now, what are the problems with these quasi-realist accounts? Well, I think the biggest one is that is a singling out of Japan, which is the most problematic one. Now, realism, I might be challenged on this one, but I personally think that realism, if you take it seriously and its assumptions seriously, is relatively colorblind, so to speak. Realism assumes that all rising powers are potential challenges to the hegemonic order, right? So any rising power would axiomatically be a zero-sum threat to American hegemony. And indeed, realist scholars who stayed most faithful to the kind of assumption, to the orthodoxies of realism around this time, such as Christopher Lane, they were arguing that countries like Germany or a newly uniting Europe could be potential threats to US pre-eminence as well. Okay, so in that, there are scholars who were actually, did not single Japan out. I think it's important to note that. This is why I'm saying that many of the proponents of the Japan threat theory were quasi-realists, because it's strayed away from this as a very, very important assumption that realism makes. Right. And you can see this, the singling out of Japan in particular, when you look at how the proponents of the Japan threat theory hardly ever talk about a reunited Germany or an integrated Europe as a threat, okay? And Friedman and Lebard, for instance, they seem to think that the tyranny of geopolitics does not apply to Germany because its exports can be shipped by land without the need for an extensive over-the-horizon foreign policy. Yet, this did not stop Hitler from wanting a Lebensraum, right? So it's strange to think that somehow those kind of geopolitical kind of things suddenly cease to matter in the back 50 years after the war. But also another pundit called James Fallows says that even when Europe and the US had trade disputes, no one imagined that the United States and the European community were about to turn their backs on each other, whereas disputes with Japan have a fragile walking on the quality which makes people think that it's dangerous to talk frankly in public. So for some curious reason, Germany and Europe are kind of excluded, right? But also, apart from these, the singling out of Japan, which is problematic, in many ways, the pundits of the Japan threat theory were getting things wrong. Okay, so in terms of Japan's economic threats, these pundits who denounced Japan's unfair trading policies ignore the fact that Japan had, in fact, been reducing trade barriers over time. But also, it wasn't just with Japan that the US was having trade deficits with. There are plenty of other countries where America had trading deficits. But yet again, it was only Japan that got singled out. But also, with regards to the dangers of Japan buying up the US, which Huntington talked about, Japanese direct investment in the US was only about half of that of British and about the same as that of the Dutch. And yet nobody started talking about a Dutch invasion of America. So it seems, yet again, rather strange that it's just Japan that gets singled out here. So why are these kind of quasi-realist theories racist then? A couple of points can be made. One thing is that Campbell has argued that with regard to Japan's unfair trading practices, Campbell has argued that certain economic relations were taken to be an indicator of civilization and echo racist historical discourse that labeled the Japanese as barbarians because of their reluctance to trade. Okay, that's one point. But also, and when it comes to geopolitical arguments, the fact that Japan is seen to be unable to somehow escape the tyranny of geopolitics, yet again, kind of does resonate with the Orientalist discourses, which see the non-Western world as chaotic and irrational. And in contrast, when you look at the case of Germany, it's because of the rational and progressive political project of European integration, of which we are sitting in the kind of symbol of, right? That somehow made Germany exempt from the tyranny of geopolitics. So you can get the kind of contrast between the irrational Orient and the rational progressive West kind of creeping into this way of looking at things. And arguably, such discourses locate difference in terms of culture and institutions and elevate the West to exceptional status. Okay, and the fact that even a highly developed, established democracy like Japan can't escape this category only reinforces the impression that the line that demarcates Japan from Germany is one which is based on racial difference. Also, the tendency to either ignore or explain away any potential threats from Western power while emphasize the Japanese ones, it's a view that's shared with scientific racism, where there is a propensity toward the barbaric races high, if not extremely high, levels of Eastern agency that is predatory in nature, as noted by Hobson. And a good example of this kind of comes from Edith Cresson, who said that Japan is an adversary who does not respect the rules of the game and whose overwhelming desire is to conquer the world. Or the Japanese are yellow dwarfs who sit up all night thinking of ways to screw us.
Who's Edith Cresson? Sorry.
She was the then French Prime Minister. Yes, yes.
When, sorry?
1980s, around the time of late Nakasone or early Takeshita.
I see.
Yes. Luckily, she's been out of power for some time, but there we go. Yes. Okay, so that's one. The other one is differentialist racism. Okay, and this argument says that Japan is a threat because its civilizational culture is fundamentally alien and different from that of the West. There are two variations on this theme. One theme is to say that Japan might be a democracy, but it actually really isn't a democracy. It's a state pretending to be a democracy. So there's no way it can be like us. That's another one. I think the most famous proponent of this was a guy called Karel van Wolferen.
Right.
Yes, and no surprises there for those Japan watchers. The other one was essentialized culturalist or civilizational tropes to suggest that Japan was an alien other. That's the second strand of this. Okay, and it's the second one, which is arguably the more kind of one linked to racism. But a couple of quotes here. So James Fallows, he expressed concerns over the weakness of universal principles in Japan, and and Fallows said that Japan was somehow under the influence of Shinto religion, which has no overarching theory of behavior and virtually no scripture or teachings. And he said that this meant that the Japanese would only care for their own people and not demonstrate any empathy for those who are considered to be outsiders, right? Interesting observation, and one might wonder if that kind of empathy was exercised in the 19th century during, when racism was at its apogee. Meanwhile, Huntington said that the economic issues between the United States and Europe are no less serious than those between the United States and Japan, but they do not have the same political salience and emotional intensity because the differences between American culture and European culture are so much less than those between American civilization and Japanese civilization. Classic Huntington, really. Yeah. And these kind of views are deeply problematic because they ignore the fact that Japan has been influenced by multiple civilizations over time. Shintoism, Buddhism, is one, but liberalism, anarchism, communism, all these things have had an impact in Japanese society. But somehow these, the fact that, cross-cultural pollination and cross-cultural or inter-civilizational interaction and mutual influence happen, right? All these facts are completely ignored. And as a result, Japanese civilization identity also gets fixed as well, okay? So given that multicultural interaction and cross-fertilization is somehow rendered impossible, the possibility of Japan to be assimilated into the West becomes an impossibility. It is denied, okay? Now, in what way is this racist? In a way, it's racist in the sense that it de-emphasizes biological, it certainly does de-emphasize biological traits and it emphasizes cultural difference, insurmountable cultural difference. At first glance, this might not be seen as racist, but culture and civilization can be used as a substitute for biological traits. And Etienne Balibar states that this can be considered a differentialist form of racism. And this is echoed by Doty, who says that culture, like nature, functions as a way of locking individuals and groups a priori into an immutable determination. And a typical example of this is anti-Semitism, where individuals of Jewish heritage are differentiated, treated as alien others, even if their ethnic makeup and social integration makes them undistinguishable from the ethnic majority, right? And we need not, remind ourselves of what happened if we take it that kind of differentialist racism extremes. And in the context of the Japan threat, you could say that differentialist racism was used effectively to evict Japan from the predominantly white West, to which it had previously been considered to be a member of. And in similar fashion to German Jews, who suddenly found their different cultural heritage highlighted and subsequently excluded from German society, Japan's alien culture was emphasized, rendering its position as a member of the West increasingly tenuous, right? So this is, so in a way, the Japan threat theory did constitute a redrawing of the color line. And it consisted of redrawing the boundaries of the West as well. And during the Cold War, a state needed only to maintain friendly relations with the US and its allies to be counted as part of the West. And Japan was included precisely for this reason. But after the Cold War, proponents of the Japan threat basically redrew the boundaries of the West in much narrower terms to include only Western Europe and North America, which were predominantly white states that were deemed to share the same civilization, so to speak. So Japan thus was no longer a part of the predominantly white West. In fact, it is now an other and subsequently a threat. So why does this redrawing of the global color line happen then? A couple of things which I mentioned earlier, right? It could be a reaction to the perceived ontological insecurities felt by predominantly white states whenever a racial other, which was superficially treated as an equal state, starts calling into question the pre-existing racial hierarchies and starts triggering anxieties about the imminent decline of the West. But also, as Bader's work has reminded us, the lingering influence of the legacy of white dominance means that the rise of a non-white power is likely to be seen as a qualitatively different threat from both white Western hegemony and white notions of superiority. So you could say that the redrawing of the global color line can be a strategy that can be taken towards these non-white upstarts who've attained a degree of equality with the whites by closely following the norms of the white majority, right? And in order to re-establish sentiments of white superiority, one can emphasize positive qualities exclusive to white races and negative qualities unique to the non-white race. And so that's one strategy. But it could also be to protect the sentiments of the superiority or the purity of the white elite group's identity. So given that one cannot alter one's race, the non-white upstart is forever unable to possess the characteristics that make the white race exceptional. And this confirms the former's subordinate position. So in a way, it's a kind of coping strategy for ontological insecurities. Arguably, you could also say that the redrawing the global color line is resurrecting a racial field as well. Okay, Paul Musgrave and Daniel Nexon have recently claimed that world politics is a sphere of complex social stratification where various hierarchies are based on social fields. And but the Japan threat could be seen as the construction of membership in different racial groups as field-relevant capital for states and other actors. Okay. Now we might remind ourselves that the talks of the Japan threat emerged at the time of growing anxiety of America's decline, right? And of course the areas in which America used to reign supreme was a field where military and economic resources served as critical field-relevant capital. Now that Japan was kind of catching up with the US on this one, maybe a new field need to be created to kind of buttress this idea of American superiority. So the recreation of a racial field could be interpreted as an attempt to re-elevate the US and the West's superior position in the social hierarchy. And by emphasizing Japan's difference, proponents of the Japan threat sought to portray Japan as fundamentally ill-suited for global leadership that only the US and the West could provide as well. And this could link to American exceptionalism as well, right? So while the term civilization, was used, the Japan threat thesis effectively made civilizational qualities unique to predominantly white states, field-relevant capital, and allowed the US to reassert its superior position. So, what are the conclusions or implications? One thing is, it's dead simple. Race still matters and matters more than we think. Even Japan couldn't escape it, despite being a developed liberal democracy. So, there's no reason to think that the same dynamic will apply to states such as maybe South Korea or Turkey, maybe. And the Japan threat theory kind of fizzled out very, very quickly once Japan's economy tanked. But even 10 years on, it's quite interesting to see that certain commentators were still talking about certain civilization qualities as field-relevant capital. Yeah, and the quote here by Henry Now, he gives, he says that the United States is basically going to win and will continue to win, right? Anyway, so those are the conclusion implications, but we're going to end in a slightly different way to point out problems with this paper, okay? So, firstly, the links to global order making, are they actually tenuous? I'm not quite sure if it was as clear as it could be, or should I even drop the global order making, right? Now, and when it comes to originality and contribution, arguably the biggest, one of the biggest weakness is that actually I haven't said that much. I talk about the dynamic nature of redrawing the color line, but instead, in a way, by saying that race matters and actually even China, Japan, or India can't actually escape it, I'm actually highlighting the rigidity of the racial boundary, right? So, in other words, I unwittingly solidify the boundaries paradoxically by arguing about the dynamic nature. Ouch. This is a problem. And so how can this be resolved, or how can the contribution be repackaged to kind of account for this, right? So that's one, that's one question mark. Another one would be, or could it actually be repackaged by linking Western or white hegemony to ontological security a lot more? Should that be the main feature? Or could actually it be repackaged as a paper which says that racial fields actually can still matter and can still be resurrected whenever, let's say, economic or military fields are being challenged by a non-white state? And that's potentially another way of doing it. So drawing pretty much using Musgrave and Nexon's paper and basically running away with it, right? But also, how do we deal with pesky questions like how can the author explain the recent development of international politics, particularly in the war in Ukraine, in which Japan is clearly in the Western, European, and American camp, whereas China and India are not? Who draws the line here? Yes. I mean, the first part, is, I think, is potentially explainable in saying that, the racial boundaries change according to political interests. I think that's nothing particularly surprising here, right? But who draws the line is a fairly interesting question as well. Right. So, but there could, of course, be many, many more issues here.
Yeah.
So I'll stop here and submit myself to your target practice, I guess.
Thank you. Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.